My name is Bayle Conrad, and I'm a program coordinator at Harborview Medical Center. This is a series of presentations on SSI applications for newly arrived refugees. In this presentation, we will cover SSI approvals, denials, and the appeals process. So we're going to start by talking about a case approval, which is really the best case scenario before we move into what happens if you have a case that's denied. So if an SSI case is approved, the client should receive a letter stating that they're approved and also stating the amount that they will be paid each month and the amount of back pay they are owed, if any. So clients will get back pay for all of the months since they originally applied for SSI if they are approved. There are times when the amount that the client receives is lower than the maximum benefit amount, and usually this is because Social Security believes someone else is contributing to their food or shelter cost. It can also be because the client might have a spouse or someone who's working, and that will lower their maximum benefit. But if you believe it's because Social Security has incorrect information, you can call Social Security as the authorized representative and inform them that the client either pays for all the costs on their own, including housing, food, things like that, or that they will be paying those costs moving forward from the SSI funds that they receive. They might ask your client for additional information before they're able to increase the monthly benefit amount. But in my experience, if you're not sure why someone isn't receiving the full amount after they're approved, it's always okay to call and ask about why that is. Finally, once the case is approved, really that's the point where your role as the authorized representative will end. Social Security generally doesn't allow you to follow up as an authorized representative once the case is in pay. And so really the last thing that I do in these situations is try to educate my client on how to follow up with Social Security, including making sure they have the phone number, they know to call and ask for an interpreter. They also know where their local office is in case they need to go there in the future. And then really just stressing that any mailings that are received from Social Security in the future are important and may contain information that they need to respond to. If there's anything about their circumstance that changes, like they move or they have an income increase, they start working, they really should know to follow up with Social Security at that point because that will likely impact their benefits. So if your client's case is denied, there's a number of different scenarios that might happen. The first thing to note is that you have 60 days to file an appeal for reconsideration, and this deadline is important to meet so that you can continue the same claim for your client. Continuing the same claim means that the claim will continue to accrue back pay so that if it is approved, the client will then receive back pay for all of the months that they have been waiting since they applied. If you miss an appeal window, usually you'll have to start the claim over from the beginning, which means a loss of potential back pay. There's one exception to missing the appeal window, which I will discuss later in this presentation. But for basics of what to know about denials, if your client has been denied the first time, you're going to submit what is called a request for reconsideration, which the next couple of slides will cover. And you can submit this via the Social Security website or by mail or fax. This request can be completed for both medical and non-medical appeals, and we will go into what both of those mean in the next few slides. So let's start with medical denials. If a case is denied due to a medical reason, basically that Social Security does not believe the client fits their definition for disability for that specific condition, you can help your client file an appeal if they would like to move forward with doing so. In order to file an appeal, there's 3 forms that Social Security needs. The first is the request for reconsideration, which I will go over in the next few slides. The second is the disability report appeal, which is very similar to what you may have filled out when you first started the claim, but I will also go over that in the next few slides. And then the third is the medical authorization form, which is the same authorization form that your client signed originally to allow Social Security to collect their medical records, which needs to be re-signed so that Social Security can collect any new records from medical clinics on their behalf. Usually, when I'm submitting all of these forms, which you can do online or via fax or mail, I will also attach my authorized representative form as well. Even though that should still be on file from the original application, I like to attach it so that it's always attached to every single submission on behalf of that client in case Social Security can't find it on file. What happens after the appeal request is received is that a new Social Security adjudicator will review the claim from the beginning. It'll be a different person who has not yet seen the original application. Your client does not need to be re-interviewed. They will use the original interview responses as part of this new appeal. And then the process will basically be the same as what originally occurred with Social Security sending the claim to DDS, which will probably send you a new adult function report to be filled out. One important note is that calling Social Security a few weeks after you've appealed and you've submitted the appeal to verify that it was received is really important. There have been times when I have not been proactive about doing that and learned much later that for whatever reason it was not received. So putting in a calendar reminder to call in 3 or 4 weeks and really just calling to say, hi, I'm an authorized rep. I'd like to confirm that an appeal for my client was received, and then having that person confirm it from their end can really save you a lot of time in the future. So the first form that you will need to fill out to appeal an SSI denial is called the request for reconsideration. And there's an example form on this slide. In this form, I've listed the name and information of my client. Under issue being appealed, I've listed SSI disability. And then you will need to just add in a remark for why your client feels that they should not have been denied. Usually I will write something here about the reason that they cannot work. So if there are symptoms or if there's a medical diagnosis or if they're having pain, you can list here, and it can be a pretty simple sentence or two. For this example I've listed, I have significant medical diagnoses that make it hard to be mobile and cause pain. I am unable to work due to this. In the next form I'm going to go over, you will have the opportunity to add more information, but you can leave this pretty simple on this form. You're going to then mark the case review option, which is really the review for a medical denial or a non-medical denial as well, actually. And then under contact information, you can have the claimant sign it. They don't have to sign it, it's optional, but you do need to put in their information on the left-hand side at the bottom there, and then you're going to list your information on the right-hand side if you're signed up as their representative. And then the very bottom of this form is filled out by Social Security, so you do not need to fill that piece out. The second form that Social Security will need you to complete is a disability report appeal. This is very similar to the original disability report you submitted at the time your client applied for SSI. And looking through this form, you can see that the first page really just asks for basic demographics. It's not until the second page under section 3, medical conditions, that you're going to start to see some changes. Basically, from this point on throughout the report, the Social Security Administration wants to know of any medical changes since the initial application. This page allows you to describe any changes in condition, to add any new diagnoses, and to list any additional medical providers that your client may have been seen by since they originally applied. It also allows you to update Social Security on the medical clinics or conditions that the client had originally listed on their initial application. So for example, if their condition has worsened, if they've been seen by that original clinic multiple times since their initial application, there's places in this document to add that information. The final sentence on this page, which I've highlighted at the very bottom, is really important. It says, only list the providers you have seen since you last told us about your medical treatment. So this includes any visits at clinics or hospitals since you originally applied, which includes those that you originally mentioned in the original application. So for example, if your client applied in October and you are filing an appeal in April, in the next few pages of this form, you should list any provider the client was seen by from October to April, even if that provider or clinic was listed on the original application. The only time you wouldn't list a provider that was listed on the original application is if a client has not seen that provider since they originally applied. Maybe it was like a one-time specialist appointment and they didn't need to be seen again. In that case, you do not need to list that provider information on the following pages. So just like the original application, over the next few pages of the disability report for an SSI appeal, you will list out all the providers that have seen the client since they originally applied. Remember that Social Security will be requesting the medical records from these providers, so it's okay if you don't have all of the medical details you're asking for. There's also a remarks page at the end of this form to list anything that you've estimated, just like in the original disability report. One of the final sections of this report asks about any changes in activities, work, or similar support services, as you can see on the right-hand side of this slide. Once you've completed this part fully, you can submit with the 2 other required forms, adding your authorized representative form if you'd like, either online or via fax and mail to Social Security for the claim appeal to start. So let's talk about non-medical denials. At times, SSI applications will be denied for non-medical reasons, and this usually occurs pretty early on in the claim after your client has been interviewed. There are generally 2 reasons for non-medical denials. The first is that documentation was asked for and not received by a specific date. And we know that when Social Security asks for information, they generally ask for a pretty quick turnaround to receive that document or whatever they're asking for back in their office. The second reason, which can be more complicated, is that the client has assets over the maximum allowed amount. So if your client receives a denial because Social Security asked for a document or information by a specific date which was missed, it's worth calling and speaking to the representative to explain why this occurred. At times, mail will be received only by the applicant, even though I've signed on as an authorized representative and should be getting copies of it myself. If your client doesn't speak English and didn't understand what the letter was asking for, explaining this to the representative will usually allow them to keep the case open and give you extra time to submit whatever information they've asked for. Usually, Social Security gives 10-day deadlines for submitting paperwork, so it's pretty easy to miss if you haven't received that copy of that mail yourself. In an ideal situation, the case would remain open because you've spoken to the representative, they've understood that it was, an issue with not understanding what this letter stated because it's only being sent in English, and they will not have a formal denial on the case. As we'll see in a few slides, there are only a few denials allowed per case, so you want to avoid a denial due to missing a paperwork deadline if possible. If you're unable to continue with the case and the client does receive a denial for this reason, you can fill out the non-medical appeal form online or submit it via email and fax. This is a really similar form as the medical appeal form that we looked at a few slides ago. In this case, because the denial was not due to a medical reason, you do not need to fill out the disability report appeal or a new medical authorization form for the case. A more complicated reason for a non-medical denial is because the client has assets that are over the maximum allowed amount, which is $2,000 for an individual or $3,000 for a couple. There are times when this can be appealed. Usually, if there are funds over that amount in a client's bank account or they own assets in the US over that amount, like property or car, there is no way to appeal the denial unless their circumstances change and they no longer have this much in assets. The asset denials due to owning homes or property overseas can sometimes be appealed. SSA will ask during the interview process whether the client has any land or property anywhere, even in other countries. And because clients do sometimes have land, even though they've fled the country and often don't know what the status of the property or home is, if they answer yes to this question, Social Security will require them to provide documentation showing the value of the home. And in most cases, refugees don't have this information and might not even have access to that asset any longer. In that case, Social Security will assume that the land or home value is higher than the limit and will often deny the claim. So if your client receives a denial due to overseas assets that they either can't access any longer or don't know the status of, you can advocate by writing a letter with details about the asset. And the following slides, I'm going to go over some tips and tricks for helping advocate for this type of denial that I learned through my time doing these claims and just asking Social Security a lot of questions and asking to speak to their manager if I wasn't getting a good answer. Really, this is a situation where a client has fled a country that they cannot return to, and most of the time they either don't know the status of whatever asset they have, or it no longer exists, or it's maybe been taken over by someone else. And so really what your role is to explain all of that to the representative for why, realistically speaking, they're not going to be making money off of this asset. They really don't have access to it any longer. So you're probably going to need to gather some details from your client about what exactly the asset is. In my experience, it's been land, it's been homes. I think there is a pension fund that I appealed for at one point. So whatever the asset is, and then what your client knows about its current status. Sometimes clients will have family or friends overseas who can tell them generally about what's going on in that area. If they don't know, you can also look up reports or ask what area of the country it was in to try to get a sense of the general security situation in that area. And then also trying to discover some information either from your client or even looking it up online about what happens to abandoned property in that country. I found that former refugee caseworkers can be really helpful in providing some of this context because this is a very traumatic thing to be asking a client about. You're pretty much asking them to relive the situation that caused them to flee from their physical home. And so if you have, if you're working with a colleague or a partner from the same area, you could potentially ask that person just some general questions about like what happens to abandoned property in this country, or what is the general security situation like right now. So when you are appealing this, you're going to submit the request for reconsideration form with the letter that you write explaining the overseas assets. Again, because this is not a medical denial, you don't need to fill out a new disability report or the medical authorization form. You're really just going to submit that request for reconsideration form and then this letter. And really using any and all information at your disposal that will help support the claim will make it more likely that your appeal will be accepted. And I'm going to walk you through a couple of examples of appeals that have been submitted and accepted, and the claim has eventually been approved to help you write some of these letters. So the next few slides, I'm going to give a few examples of actual letters I've written. I've changed all of the identifying information, but these are based on letters that have been submitted to Social Security when a case was denied due to an overseas asset and have been accepted and the case has gone on to be approved. And hopefully you'll get a sense of some of the information that you can use to help advocate for the client that you're serving. So I start out by stating that my client, John Smith, was recently denied benefits because he previously owned land in Guatemala prior to coming to the United States. And then I list that he's a non-citizen, legally eligible for SSI benefits because he was granted asylum under Section 208 of the INA. And I mention that he's unable to return to Guatemala as he believes his safety would be at risk should he do so. So here I'm just summarizing why he was denied, why I'm writing this letter, and what his immigration status is. And again, I referred back to that non-citizen eligibility page on the Social Security website and took the language about his immigration status directly from that page so that it matches their rules. The next paragraph, I talk about what the asset is and what is known about it. So I say that John believes the title of his property was transferred to another person when he left the country. Since this time, he's had no access to the land. Family members that are in that area still have informed John that the land was transferred back to the government because no payments were made. And despite attempts by his family to provide proof of the title change, they're unable to access this documentation. I've mentioned that neither John nor anyone in his family have access to the land any longer, and I described that because John does not have ownership documents and is unable to physically return to Guatemala, he has basically relinquished ownership of this land. So here I'm describing the asset. I describe what are the attempts to get current information on the status, what are the attempts to get ownership documents, and then the general context of what property abandonment looks like in this country based on my conversation with John and his conversation with family members that are still in that area. This next section is really important and something that you can really advocate for as someone who serves refugees or new arrivals because you're very familiar with the reasons why your client may have come to the U.S. So I talk about here how John faced violence and threats against his life while living in Guatemala. He fears of ever returning to the country as he believes he will be targeted by death. And I described that prior to coming to the U.S., some family members were targeted and killed by violent gangs, and John fears that he would also be targeted by association were he to return. And due to this, he's unable to ever go back to his home state or the area where this property is located without facing extreme violence or death. So really describing the safety concerns in the area where that asset is that prevents the client from returning can be really powerful to describe here. This was all information that John told me directly. So again, this can be a really traumatic conversation to have because he's basically having to say to me, I cannot go back home because I will be killed. But being as stark and straightforward as you can in this letter to make it very clear to Social Security that there is really no access to this asset is what's going to get your appeal approved. In the next paragraph, I describe a little bit about what's going on in his life that might be an extenuating circumstance. In this case, John had a progressive case of an illness that was expected to end in death, and he had already been deteriorating pretty significantly. And so even if he didn't fear for his life, he doesn't have any income to go back to Guatemala, and he physically is already becoming immobile and really would not be able to go back. So if there are extenuating circumstances like that, that impact that person's ability to access whatever asset they own, it's also can be useful to mention that. Then I end it with a summary of all of the reasons why John no longer has access to this asset, and why we're asking for the reconsideration. Depending on how the claim was denied, you might also be asked to help write a letter for the client to provide to Social Security after they've had a conversation about this. So in this example, the SSI representative asked the client I was working with to write out a statement for the record asking about the valuation of the home in Afghanistan. It required a lot less information because the claimant had already had a conversation with the SSI representative. But in this document, he explains why he doesn't have any information to state the value of his home. He alludes to his medical memory loss or his medical condition for why he doesn't know specific details, and that's a key piece to keep in mind too. It's important to pull those pieces out if you do have a client who can't remember things very well. And then he also just discusses that his home is destroyed, and what happens to abandoned homes in his home country. And then in one final example, this was for a case that was actually based on age. So again, you can have a non-medical denial for a case you're applying for if the person is over 65. And it was denied because the client told SSI he owned a home overseas. In this letter, he states the last time he saw the home, the fact that he has no ownership documents because he was kidnapped from his home, and why he's unable to return to his country, as well as what happens to abandoned property in Iraq. So now that you know a little bit about how to file an appeal for a non-medical denial, the times in which a non-medical denial might be issued, and some example letters that you can help write to advocate for your client. Here's just some general tips about this process. If a client is ever denied based on assets or anything else non-medical, you can almost always appeal that denial. The one exception to this is if they're over income with assets they have in the US, or if they somehow still have access to their asset overseas, like if they're renting out a home or something like that. That situation you're not going to be able to appeal because the client is simply over-resourced. Anything else that's non-medical, you can really be a good advocate at this time and help your client appeal. Ownership to a client might mean something different to SSI, and I think this is why some of these cases come up where a person might say that they own a home even though realistically they have no access to it. The home might have been destroyed, the land or the home might have been taken by the government or a group, and so realistically they don't gain anything in financial benefit from that asset and have no way to sell it and make money or profit, which is really what Social Security is concerned about, right? They're just concerned about making sure that anyone who's receiving SSI benefits doesn't have over a certain amount of resources or assets. I found that clients might be concerned that if they say they don't own any land or a home, even if it's in this type of situation where they're pretty sure that the government has taken it over, they know it's been destroyed, they have no access to it, they're really worried about it coming across that they're lying to a government official, and so they really are adamant to say, no, I own this. And then speaking from a more trauma-informed lens, it might also be really important for a client to state that they own the home, given that they've had to flee and leave it. Maybe to them, symbolically owning that place still is really important. So I think that's why some of these non-medical denials occur, and your role is to really advocate and to explain some of this to the Social Security representative who likely does not know a lot of the ins and outs of the refugee program in the United States or what it's like to have a refugee status or similar immigration status here. I would say in general for these letters, just to recap, these are a couple of things that you can include in all of them if they're applicable. First is making it clear that there's no option to get documents regarding the property value or ownership, and also making sure to list any efforts the client has made to get them. For example, the client in Guatemala, we listed that his family, he actually contacted his family back home and tried to see if there was any possible way to get anything from the government. If your client was persecuted by the government, or the government themselves doesn't have the documentation that they're asking for, you can list this as a factor, right? I had a Rohingya client who was technically supposed to receive a retirement fund or pension from whatever job he had in Burma, but that was the same government that actually persecuted him and caused his reason for coming to the United States. So it doesn't make any sense that a government entity or asset would be given to somebody who is being persecuted by that same government, even though maybe at some point in time they weren't being persecuted, which is why this person had this pension or retirement fund. Stressing their immigration status and describing the fact that it impacts their ability to return home and that they've had to provide proof of persecution to even get to where they are can be really helpful. And it's, again, something that a lot of Social Security representatives might not have had any exposure to or might not understand. So just explaining that in the letter is useful. If you're being told, and I have been told this, that there's no way around it, if they own something overseas, there's nothing you can do, continue calling Social Security, ask for a manager, ask to speak to someone else. This is part of your role as an advocate, and it can really make or break someone's ability to have some financial resources that they are eligible for. The way that I have learned how to navigate these non-medical denials is by asking and advocating and pushing until, the Social Security Administration really understood where my client was coming from and the fact that they really literally have no way of accessing this asset. And in fact, it really is not an asset that they can buy or sell or anything like that. Usually, once Social Security understands the situation a little bit better, they will accept a letter that, like the ones that I've shown in the past few slides, as proof that there's no way to get documentation of their asset or to access the asset. And on their end, that is enough to decide to push the claim forward and keep it open and move forward in determining whether they can be approved. The last thing I'll say about this is that these can be really difficult conversations. It's not a fun place to be in as a caseworker, and definitely not as a client who you're asking to relive their trauma, to describe literally sometimes the exact situations that led to the loss of their home, both, physically and psychologically, and to describe the home country conditions. And so keeping that in mind, that this is just not an easy conversation to have before you go into it, can also be helpful. So now that I've talked about that first denial, and we've gone through both a medical appeal and a non-medical appeal, what happens next? Basically, if your appeal is accepted by Social Security, which generally it is, the claim will go through the same process that we originally described. And at this point, where a determination will be made, it can be denied again or it can be approved. If your client receives a second denial and they want to continue appealing the claim, the next step is to schedule a hearing before a judge. The client can either decide to represent themselves in a hearing or to get assistance from a local law firm. Generally, if a local law firm is used, and I know a lot of resettlement agencies have connections to partner law firms that assist with this type of claim, they will charge a fee if the claim is approved, and it will be a percentage of the back pay that the client is owed. So, in my experience, when clients reached this point in the process, they almost always decided to have the assistance of a legal aid in this kind of manner. And at this point, as a caseworker, I would kind of step out of the process and have the legal aid take over as the authorized representative and moving the claim forward, because I don't have enough legal expertise to continue serving the client in their best, in their best interest. So if you don't have a connection to a legal clinic or law firm that does disability cases, it's a good idea to find one in the community. The one that I've worked with in my community had interpretation and also would sometimes reach out to me very rarely after I referred the case over, just in case there was someone that, a point person that could be to help with interpretation, but trying to make sure that it's a firm that is aware that your clients might not speak English is really important. And then if you are referring a case at this point to a law firm, it's important to remember that despite who is taking the case over, the client still only has 60 days to file an appeal. So making sure, that it's really clear if you're going to file that appeal for them or if the law firm is. In my experience, the law firm has wanted to file this appeal because this is where they put their information in and show that they are going to be representing the case moving forward, but just making sure you meet that deadline. So again, that case continues from the original application. One final situation that you might find yourself in when assisting a client with an SSI application is that you have missed the appeal window. So you have 60 days to appeal a denial for SSI, and there may be times when that window has passed and you were not aware for whatever reason. This is why it's a good idea to try to set up some type of check-in system for the claims that you're working on, because you don't want to get into a situation where you're going to have to write what's called a good cause letter, even though usually they are accepted, but it's just going to delay the claim that much longer. So a good cause letter is a letter that you write with your client to basically explain why you missed the appeal window. And Social Security refers to it as a good cause letter. But basically, you need to explain the circumstances that kept the client from making the request on time and, what their limitations were. So if they had any physical, mental, linguistic limitations, which includes not being able to speak or read English, that may have prevented the client from filing a timely request. So there's a specific list of reasons why SSI would approve a good cause letter. The two that I have used in the past have been either a time when a client did not receive the denial in the mail for whatever reason, or they received it and didn't speak English or read English to know what the letter meant. Usually, these cases have been at times when I have signed up to be an authorized representative, but either didn't receive the mail myself, or by the time my representation was processed by Social Security, they had already sent out a denial. So for example, there was a case I had where a client was denied based on her immigration status, and that happened very quickly after the interview, even though she did qualify based on her immigration status. But because it happened so quickly after the interview, it was before my authorized representation was processed. I did not receive a letter as I should have, and she didn't receive the letter or didn't understand what it meant. So there will be a link to what Social Security determines as good cause in the guide that is connected with this presentation on the Ethnomed website. But this is one avenue you can go down if you find out that you're late appealing a denial, because you really want to keep that continued claim in order to get your client the most benefits that they possibly can have. And when you write this letter, what you're going to do is you're going to submit it with that reconsideration request form to Social Security, just like you would when you're filing any other appeal.